Hi, Richard Foster from Foster Infrastructure here. I'm often asked, how do governments in Australia decide whether an infrastructure project should be delivered as a public-private partnership or PPP or as a traditionally delivered infrastructure project? Today I'm going to answer that question through a critical review of how the decision was made for a very large PPP that is out to tender here at the moment in late 2019, and that's the North East Link Road project. If you take a look at Australia's national PPP policy and guidance material, you'll find a 5-step process set out for deciding how an infrastructure project should be procured. Should it be a PPP or delivered through some traditional form of contract or another more innovative form of procurement? The 5-step process set out here starts with data gathering. We then shortlist a range of possible procurement models. So there might be one or more different forms of PPP that might be suitable for the project. There might also be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 different forms of traditional contract that might be suitable. It's not just a choice of a PPP versus a traditional delivery. Step 3 is what the guidance refers to as validation. I tend to think about it more as detailed research, a detailed investigation of how these shortlisted procurement models have been used in the past, in this sector, in different sectors, what have been the issues, what have been the benefits, and how might they relate to the current project under consideration. Step 4 is a detailed comparative analysis of the different shortlisted procurement methods against a set of criteria to identify which procurement method best meets our objectives for the project. Step 5 then is the identification of our preferred delivery model and the refinement of that model to suit the particular needs of the project. So that's the 5-step process set out in the guidance, but in reality it all comes together in that 4th step where we do a comparative analysis of the different shortlisted procurement models. So let's take a look at how that worked in the North East Link project. I've chosen this project because it's a project that I have not been involved in, and therefore I'm not breaching any confidentiality obligations. I'm not biased by my own personal involvement, but it is a project where the government released the business case, made that public, and so we actually have in detail the thinking behind the choice of the procurement model. So based on my experience leading the analysis of options for PPP delivery or traditional delivery in other projects, and based on the publicly available information about the North East Link, I'm going to take you through the logic and we'll see if it makes sense. So first, a bit of background about the North East Link project. This is a project in Melbourne, where I live. Melbourne is a large city located on the northern tip of a large bay. The city has a reasonably well-developed freeway network, but in terms of there being a ring road around the city so that traffic from different directions can get from one side to the other without going through the city centre, there is a missing link. There's a missing link in the northeast part of the network, and this is where the North East Link is being built. This will be a very large project. At current exchange rates, it's expected that the cost will be around $9 billion US, just in terms of construction costs. The project will involve extensive excavation and tunnelling, and Melbourne has quite difficult ground conditions, so there are expected to be significant geotechnical and tunnelling risks. The road will be tolled, but due to some past toll road failures in Australia and the challenges of assessing and managing demand risk on the road, there is limited private sector appetite for that risk. In other words, the private sector sees the risk associated with the level of traffic and the potential revenue as really quite significant and potentially a barrier to them investing in this project. So it's unclear whether the state, the government, or the private sector will be best placed to manage that traffic risk. And the market appetite from the private sector for PPP models where they would take that traffic risk is quite limited. The decision making that has driven the choice of the delivery model for this project is really captured in this single slide. There's a lot of work that goes on behind this, but this brings together a lot of analysis and puts it in a simple, easy to understand form that gives us clear direction in terms of the preferred delivery model for the project, which in this case is an availability PPP. Let me take you through this table and explain it to you. We start with a set of procurement criteria. These are the criteria that the government has decided are important in determining what is the right procurement model or delivery method for the project. In other words, these criteria reflect the important considerations and issues that affect whether we choose one form of procurement or another. And here they are. Let's go through them one by one. The first of our criteria is maximise market interest. In other words, we want to get a good competitive outcome from a tender process for the project. And so an important consideration is what form of delivery, what form of contract will provide us with the best competitive outcome from the market. The next of our criteria is transport network integration. Different forms of delivery will have different consequences in terms of how this road integrates into the wider transport network. It's important to us that this road isn't an isolated single corridor. It will actually form part of the overall road network for the City of Melbourne. The next of our criteria is price and budget certainty. This will always be important to governments, particularly to finance ministries or treasury departments who are concerned that we are getting value for money from our infrastructure. We don't want to embark on the tender process for a project where there's a great deal of uncertainty about how much it's going to cost, and particularly for a very large project like this, billions and billions of dollars, we really need a good degree of confidence that the project can be delivered within the approved budget. Our next consideration is risk transfer. Different delivery models will be more or less effective at transferring risk in different circumstances. It depends upon what the project is, what the risks are, and so on. But for government, we want to transfer to the private sector those risks that the private sector is better able to manage. If there are risks that government is better able to manage, government should retain those risks. And sometimes there are risks that are best shared. Sometimes government and the private sector need to collaborate together in order to manage certain risks. So risk transfer is an important consideration. The next of our criteria is innovation. Innovation brings benefits for government in terms of greater value or lower cost. And there are opportunities in very large projects for some quite significant innovation. So to the extent that a particular delivery method will be better at promoting innovation, that means perhaps we would prefer that delivery method over other delivery methods that are likely to be less innovative. Time is an important consideration, so that's our next criterion. Naturally, governments want infrastructure to be completed so that it starts delivering the service or the amenity that we're after. It's not construction that's important, it's the services or the amenity that the infrastructure provides that's important. And in different circumstances, different forms of contract, different delivery methods will be more or less effective in delivering the infrastructure on time. The next of the criteria is operational performance. Operational performance is important because we don't just want to build a shiny new road, we want a road that will provide good operational outcomes over the long term. And our final criterion is one that interests me. I haven't seen this very often. That's not to say it's wrong. In fact, I think it's quite insightful that they've included this as one of the criteria for this project. That last criterion is simplicity. In other words, we don't want necessarily an overly complex delivery model unless that is going to give us good outcomes when looked at against our other criteria. All other things being equal, we would rather have a simple, a less complex delivery model than a more complex delivery model. I think that's a fairly natural and sensible approach. So when we're looking at different delivery models for projects in Australia, we'll come up with a set of criteria like this. It's not always the same set because different projects have different circumstances. What's important in one project might not be so important in another project. So it is really a case-by-case decision as to what are the right criteria. And this is one of the really important policy decisions in a sense for government. What is important to government in this project? What are the most important things to government? And that needs to inform what the criteria are. Having decided on our criteria, we then typically assign a weighting to them. Usually it's a fairly simple weighting system. The criteria are either of high importance, moderate importance, or low importance. In this case, they took a look at the criteria and they decided some of them were of high importance and some were of moderate importance. They decided that none of them were of low importance. That's not all that unusual. Usually, really, we are focusing on things that are reasonably important in making these decisions. So most of them are highly important or moderately important. Overall, to me, this seems like a sensible, logical set of criteria for this particular project, and I can understand how they came to them. There are some potential issues in there of possible overlap between the criteria, but we can come back to that when we look at the later stages of the process and see whether we think there are overlaps or there aren't overlaps between these criteria. So let's come back to that point. Having identified our criteria, we then identify a short list of those delivery models that might be suitable for this project. So we do an initial look at different forms of contract and we decide which ones are good candidates for this particular project, usually based on have they been used before for similar projects, what's been the experience overseas, what's been the experience in other sectors, and so on. And so we come to an initial view and there might be 3 or 4 possible delivery models. There might be more. In this case, there were some delivery models that were discarded and not put on the shortlist, and they included models such as undertaking a complete design of the project and then tendering a construct-only contract or a build-only contract for someone to build to that exact design. It was decided that that was not a suitable method, but there were a total of 5 possible methods that were shortlisted. So let's go through them. The first of them, D and C, as we call it in Australia, design and construct. This is what in some other countries is called design build, DB, or sometimes EPC, engineering, procurement and construction. So this is where we ask a contractor to complete a design and build the project under the one contract, typically on a fixed price, fixed time basis, although the fixed time, fixed price aspect of that contract sometimes falls apart if the project gets into difficulty. The next of our shortlisted procurement options is something called an alliance. Now, this is quite common in infrastructure procurement in Australia and New Zealand, less common in many other countries, and it's a fairly innovative and collaborative form of infrastructure procurement where government and the private sector form a single team to cooperatively deliver the project. And most of the risks are shared. The risks aren't allocated to one party or the other. They're shared by both parties. Our third delivery method is a design, build, operate and maintain contract. So this takes the design and construct concept and integrates with that contract a term in which the contractor also operates and maintains the infrastructure. Now, they are paid for construction as construction progresses, so there's no private finance, but we do bring together in the one contract the design and construction of the infrastructure and a period of operating and maintaining the infrastructure. Our fourth model is an availability PPP. I mentioned earlier that the road will be tolled, so the availability PPP model would involve government collecting the tolls and then government using the tolls and other government revenues if necessary in order to pay availability payments to the private sector under a PPP arrangement. So the payments would be conditional upon the road being available for use and complying with a set of performance requirements. So that's one of the most common forms of government pays PPP. Our final option is an economic PPP, as it's called in this analysis. An economic PPP is a user pays PPP. This would be where the private sector designs and builds the infrastructure, operates and maintains it, and collects the tolls from the users and uses that toll revenue to repay the finance that the private sector borrowed in order to build the road in the first place. So this is your classic toll road PPP model. So here we've got 5 different forms of contract. 2 of them are PPPs, and we need to decide which of those is going to be most effective in delivering our desired outcomes from the project. In other words, which of those 5 delivery methods performs best when assessed against our criteria. In order to make that assessment, we need some sort of a rating system or a scoring system. The approach we usually take is a qualitative scoring system with a number of ticks or crosses or some other semi-numerical indicator of the comparative performance of each of the delivery models against the criteria. So in this project, the rating system was one of 3 ticks, 2 ticks, 1 tick, or a cross, where 3 ticks signifies that the particular delivery model would be extremely effective in meeting the particular criteria. 2 ticks signifies that the delivery model would be effective in meeting the requirements of the criteria. 1 tick signifies that the delivery model would just meet the requirements of the criteria. In other words, it's just a pass, but it's not particularly strong. And a cross signifies that the particular delivery model would be ineffective in meeting that criterion. So, with that scoring system in place, let's take a look at how these different delivery models scored against our criteria. So, our first criterion was maximising market interest, and it had a high weighting. Now, against this criterion, market soundings were conducted to test market appetite for the project, and what was found was that for the design and construct contract, the alliance, the design, build, operate and maintain, and the availability PPP, there was very strong interest from the private sector, and therefore each of those delivery models scored 3 ticks against that criterion. In contrast, as I mentioned earlier, for an economic PPP where the private sector is taking the traffic risk, there was only limited market appetite, and so that one only scored 1 tick. Our second criterion was transport network integration. In other words, how does each delivery method enable us to effectively manage the entire transport network, including this road? Against this criterion, the design and construct contract and the alliance scored highly. They are models where government can have a lot of influence upon the project. They are models where at the completion of construction, government manages the road. So for those particular models, the project could be very well integrated into the transport network. The design, build, operate and maintain contract and the availability PPP involve handing over certain functions in relation to the road beyond the design and construction period, handing those functions over to the private sector, which potentially constrains how government can manage the broader network. If we want to make a change, say 5 years into operation, we might need to go and negotiate with our contractor in order to have any necessary changes reflected in the PPP or the design, build, operate and maintain project. An economic PPP provides the least transport integration of all these delivery models because it's really isolating a single part of the network, allowing the private sector to charge a toll on that individual part of the network, and having in place a long-term contract under which anything that affects the level of traffic on this particular road is going to be of concern to the private sector and potentially have consequences under the PPP contract. So we really need to think that through. For that reason, the DNC and the Alliance each scored 3 ticks against this criterion. The availability PPP and the design, build, operate and maintain contracts scored 2, and the economic PPP scored 1. Our next criterion was price and budget certainty, and we have good data in Australia on the price and budget certainty of different forms of infrastructure delivery. And it is quite clear from the data that traditional forms of contract, like a design and construct contract or design, build, operate and maintain, while they may be fixed price contracts in one sense, they do tend to create opportunities for cost overruns compared to PPPs, where much more often we do actually get the project delivered for the expected budget. Alliances, I mentioned earlier, alliances involve risk sharing much more than risk allocation, and the experience with alliances is they are suitable for some projects where we really do need to share the risks with the private sector in order to effectively manage them. But from the alliance model, we get very little price certainty. In fact, the experience with alliance projects is one of significant cost overruns or cost increases. So for those reasons, the design and construct and design, build, operate and maintain contracts were regarded as just effective in terms of their price and budget certainty, and so they received 1 tick. The alliance was regarded as ineffective, so it received a red cross. So we're already suggesting the alliance might not be the right form of delivery for this project. And then the PPPs, based on our past experience, have a high level of price and budget certainty, so they received 3 ticks. Our next criterion was risk transfer. Now you might think there's a bit of overlap between risk transfer and price and budget certainty, because if we transfer the risks, we should get more price and budget certainty. So are we double counting here? Well, I took a deep dive into the additional information provided in the business case supporting this analysis. And the way the business case looked at risk transfer in terms of this analysis, they did not focus on risk transfer in terms of price. They focused on the whole of life perspective and whether government was transferring risk over the life cycle of the asset and the potential benefits that would have. So I actually don't think there was an overlap. I think they took the right approach by making sure they weren't double counting under these 2 separate criteria by looking at different issues under each of the criteria. So in terms of risk transfer, while they're looking at different issues, the pattern is actually quite similar to that for price and budget certainty, but for different reasons. As I said, in terms of risk transfer, it's looking at the whole life cycle. The alliance, the design and construction contract, and the design, build, operate and maintain contract only relate to part of the life cycle of the infrastructure, compared to the PPP options, which tend to focus on a much longer term and also provide much better incentives to the private sector to manage the risks over the life cycle of the quality and performance of the asset. And so for that reason, against this criteria, once again we see 1 tick for design and construct, a cross for the alliance, because the alliance is focused on risk sharing, not risk transfer, 1 tick for design, build, operate and maintain, and 3 ticks for each of the PPP options. Our next criterion is innovation, only medium weighted, less important than some of the others, but still sufficiently important to bring it into consideration. Now, what's going to drive innovation? Well, what's going to drive innovation from the private sector is the financial incentives that they might have to innovate. And innovation in a road project of this nature is somewhat limited, but it's mostly going to come from looking at the long term and the relationship between the construction of the asset and its operation and maintenance. And for that reason, what we see is the design and construct contract and the alliance only provide quite limited opportunities for innovation. The design, build, operate and maintain contract, because it does give the private sector some operations and maintenance responsibility as well as design and construction, it does provide some incentives for the private sector to innovate by looking at better design, to provide better operational outcomes or better maintenance outcomes, better construction quality perhaps, and so on. Likewise, the availability PPP provides similar incentives, while the economic PPP, because the private sector is collecting the revenue from the users, provides a stronger incentive again for the private sector to innovate in order to attract greater traffic, in order to provide a better experience for the road users, and so on. So in terms of innovation, we have 1 tick for design and construct, 1 tick for the alliance, 2 ticks for the design, build, operate and maintain, 2 for the availability PPP, and 3 for the economic PPP. Our next criterion is time, and here all of the delivery methods actually score quite well. Even the alliance, which we saw was quite poor for price and budget certainty, it scores quite well for time, because by having a combined project team from government and the private sector, and sharing the risks between government and the private sector, everyone will work together to complete the project on time. But what we do find is that compared to the other models, PPPs are more effective in terms of on-time delivery. And the key driver behind that is the fact that there is private sector investment and government, to a large extent, does not pay until after construction. In a large project like this, there may be some government payments during construction, what some people call co-financing, but for the most part, most of the private sector's cash flow will come after construction is completed, so they have a very strong incentive in the PPPs to complete the project on time. So in terms of time, the traditional delivery models all score 2 ticks, the PPP models both score 3 ticks. Our next criterion is operational performance. Now this obviously is focused on what happens after construction is completed. So those delivery models that focus solely on construction, design and construct and alliance, they don't offer such strong opportunities through the procurement model to deliver good operational performance. It's really up to government to make sure that the contract will drive the right operational outcomes and government to manage the road after construction is completed. In contrast, the design, build, operate and maintain and the availability PPP, they can require the private sector to achieve a certain level of operational performance once the road is completed and provide stronger incentives for good operational performance. The economic PPP, where the private sector is collecting the tolls, that provides a stronger incentive because the private sector will want to keep the road operational so that they can keep collecting the tolls. So there we have 1 tick for D&C and Alliance, 2 ticks for DBOM and Availability PPP, and 3 ticks for the Economic PPP. Our final criterion is simplicity. We don't want to unnecessarily choose an overly complex procurement method. And you won't be surprised if you know anything about PPPs, you won't be surprised to learn that the PPPs are the most complex of the procurement methods listed here. The PPPs involve private sector finance. They bring together design and construction and operations and maintenance into one very large contract, and that makes for a very complex procurement process. The design and construct contract is the simplest. It's a fairly standard type of contract for infrastructure procurement. And the alliance and the design, build, operate and maintain models, they're sort of in between the design and construct and the PPP models in terms of their complexity. So here we have 3 ticks for the design and construct contract, 2 in terms of simplicity for the design, build, operate and maintain and alliance contracts, and 1 tick for each of the PPPs. So that's the assessment of the different delivery models against the criteria. How do we now bring all this together? Well, we can simply add up all the ticks for each procurement option, and that will give us our so-called unweighted score. So the design and construct contract has 15 ticks, the alliance has 12 ticks, the design, build, operate and maintain has 15 ticks, the availability PPP has 19 ticks, the economic PPP has 18 ticks. So on an unweighted basis, the availability PPP has come out on top with the highest score. But we did weight our criteria. We said that some were more important and had high importance and others were only moderately important. We should take that into account. So we take that into account by giving what we call a weighted score, where each tick for a highly weighted criteria is worth 3 points. So if you have 1 tick against a highly weighted criteria, you get 3 points. If you have 2 ticks, you get 6 points. If you have 3 ticks, you get 9 points. While the moderately weighted criteria are only worth 2 points per tick. So if you have 1 tick on a moderately weighted criterion, you get 2 points, 2 ticks, 4 points, 3 ticks, 6 points. So when we add the ticks together in that weighted fashion, what do we find? Well, the design and construct has a weighted score of 40. The alliance has a weighted score of 32. The design, build, operate and maintain has a weighted score of 39. So the design and construct contractors actually snuck ahead on a weighted basis, snuck ahead of the design, build, operate and maintain. But then our availability PPP has a weighted score of 52 and our economic PPP has a weighted score of 47. So when we look at those weighted scores, we can now identify that the availability PPP has the highest overall score and is our first ranked delivery method. The economic PPP is second. The design and construct is third. Design, build, operate and maintain fourth. And the alliance comes fifth. And so that's the basis on which an availability PPP was chosen as the preferred procurement model for this project. Okay, so based on the available information, do I think that is good, robust, sensible analysis or not? Well, I would say yes. To me, it follows the guidance appropriately, and so they have followed the process that government has said it will apply in deciding upon procurement models for projects. Secondly, they have chosen an appropriate set of criteria, to my mind. They are a sensible set of criteria for a project of this nature. And in applying the criteria, it appears to me that they have been aware of issues such as potential overlap between the criteria, which might result in double counting of some issues. And when you look at the detailed narrative behind this table, I believe that they have separated out each of the criteria and assessed different things under each of those criteria. They did shortlist a sensible range of possible delivery models. Perhaps they didn't need to shortlist the alliance model. I think probably most people would have suspected from the start that the alliance wouldn't perform particularly well in this assessment. It's not really the sort of project that you would normally do as an alliance. But I think well done to them for including it, because to my mind it does show that they thought about collaborative contracting models as well as PPPs and as well as more standard traditional delivery models. So, good choice of delivery models, good choice of criteria, and in terms of the assessment against the criteria, it's pretty much in line with what I would expect from my personal knowledge and experience of projects here in Australia and of the research in relation to on time, on budget performance of projects and the potential issues over the life cycle of the infrastructure. So to me, it looks like a sensible answer. Will it prove to be the right answer? Well, we probably won't know for many years because the project's in the tender process at the moment. It will take a long time to build once the tender process is completed. And really what's important are the operational outcomes that will come many years in the future. So let's hope it's a success. You may notice that in this discussion, I have not mentioned a quantitative comparison between a public sector comparator and a PPP model. In Australia, generally, that is not an essential part of our decision-making process. In contrast to many other countries where that is either standard practice or in some cases actually a requirement of the decision-making process. Why don't we do that as a standard practice in Australia? Well, I have some personal views on comparing a public sector comparator against a PPP model at this early stage of the project. I don't have the time right now to go into all that detail. I think that's a good topic for another video. So that's my quick review of the procurement decision making for the North East Link project, which also provides you with an overview of how governments in Australia generally go about this procurement decision making. How do they decide whether a project should be a PPP or not? I've got links below in the video details to the source documents, so if you want to find out more, click through those links and you'll find the national PPP policy and guidelines that we follow here in Australia, and you'll find the business case for the North East Link project that provides you with all of the detailed analysis that sat behind that simple table. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit subscribe below to make sure that you hear about future videos from Foster Infrastructure.